The pendant was cold against my palm, unnaturally so, as if it had never felt the warmth of a human touch. Its crescent shape shimmered faintly in the dim light of the shop, but when I clasped it, the air seemed to shift. The shopkeeper's smile froze, his eyes flicking to the door. "You should leave," he said in a voice that trembled. Before I could respond, a sharp pain lanced through my chest, and the world blurred around me. Shadows coiled at the edges of my vision, whispering words I couldn't understand. Then, through the haze, a figure stepped forward tall, cloaked in black, his silver eyes cutting through the dark like blades. "You've done it now," he murmured, his tone unreadable. "That pendant doesn't belong to you." The shadows behind him surged, taking the shape of beasts with glowing eyes and jagged teeth. "Run," I whispered. He smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Run if you like. They'll find you either way." Chapter 1. The Crescent pendant. Sophia Adler wasn't sure what had drawn her to the winding alley in the heart of Charleston. It wasn't a part of town she visited often. Tourists clogged the cobblestone streets, and the creaking facades of the old buildings often seemed to loom rather than welcome. And yet, here she was, staring at a flickering sign that read "Curiosities Relics" in faded gold paint. The shop's windows were murky with years of dust, and the display was a chaotic tangle of strange trinkets, an antique violin, a porcelain doll with glassy eyes, and a tarnished clock that looked like it hadn't worked in decades. She hesitated on the threshold, caught between the urge to leave and the odd pull that had brought her here in the first place. The bell above the door jingled as she stepped inside. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of aged wood and something faintly metallic. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with books, jars, and strange objects she couldn't begin to name. A clock ticked softly in the corner, though Sophia couldn't find its source. "Hello," she called out, her voice barely breaking the stillness. No answer. She wandered deeper into the shop, her fingers brushing against the edges of dusty tomes and cool, smooth glass jars filled with things she didn't want to examine too closely. It was almost peaceful, in a strange way, until she reached the back of the store. That's when she saw it. The pendant. It rested on a bed of dark velvet inside a glass case, a delicate silver chain looped around a crescent moon charm. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the crescent's surface etched with intricate designs that seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. Sophia wasn't sure how long she stood there, staring, but her heart beat faster the longer she looked at it. Without thinking, she opened the case. Her fingers brushed the cool silver, and the moment she touched it, a searing heat shot through her hand, racing up her arm and spreading through her chest like wildfire. She gasped, stumbling back a step as her vision blurred. "You shouldn't have touched that." The voice came from behind her, low and steady, laced with a warning. Sophia whirled around, clutching the pendant tightly in her hand. A man stood in the shadows of the aisle, half hidden by the flickering light of a nearby lamp. He was tall and lean, his dark hair curling slightly at his temples. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, sharp and gray, piercing her like a blade. "Why not?" she managed to ask, her voice unsteady. His gaze flicked to the pendant in her hand, then back to her face. "Because now it's bound to you." "What are you talking about?" The man stepped closer, and for the first time she noticed how tense he seemed, like a predator ready to pounce. "That pendant wasn't just sitting there for decoration," he said grimly. "It was holding something." "Holding what?" Before he could answer, the lights overhead flickered, casting strange shadows that danced along the walls. A low growl echoed through the shop, deep and guttural, making the hairs on the back of Sophia's neck stand on end. The man's jaw tightened. "We need to leave. Now." The growl grew louder, and the pendant in Sophia's hand grew warm again, almost too hot to hold. The shadows around them seemed to ripple, and she thought she saw movement in the corners of the room, something too large to be a trick of the light. "What's happening?" she demanded, her voice rising in panic. The man reached out, grabbing her wrist. "I'll explain later," he said urgently. "But if we don't leave now, you're going to meet the thing that pendant was meant to keep locked away." Sophia hesitated, but the growl turned into a snarl. and the shadows twisted into something that looked far too much like claws. Her heart pounded as she let him pull her toward the door. They barely made it outside before the shop's lights died completely. For a moment, Sophia thought she saw something moving behind the dusty windows, something with glowing eyes and teeth like knives. The man didn't stop until they were halfway down the street, his grip on her wrist firm but not painful. Only then did he let go, turning to face her with an intensity that made her stomach twist. "You need to listen to me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "That pendant, it's not just some antique. It's a prison. And whatever you just unleashed, it's not going to stop until it finds you." Chapter 2, The Shadow Unleashed. Sophia struggled to keep pace with the man as he weaved through Charleston's labyrinth of alleys. His grip on her wrist had left a faint warmth, though her own fingers still tingled from the pendant's earlier heat. "Wait," she panted, pulling back to stop him. "You can't just drag me through the streets without explaining what's going on." He slowed, glancing around as though expecting something to leap out of the shadows. Then, finally, he turned to face her, his gray eyes sharp with frustration. "Fine," he said, his voice clipped. "We've got maybe 5 minutes before it finds us again, so listen carefully. That pendant wasn't just keeping something locked away, it was binding it to this world. And by touching it, you broke the seal." Sophia stared at him, her pulse still racing. "Are you seriously telling me this is about magic? Curses? Whatever it is you think A guttural snarl cut her off, freezing the words in her throat. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, thick and suffocating, creeping toward them like a storm cloud. The man cursed under his breath. "We don't have time for this. Come on," but Sophia planted her feet, holding up the pendant. "No, I'm not going anywhere until you tell me what this thing is and what's coming after me." He glared at her, his jaw clenching, but then he exhaled sharply. "Fine. You want answers. That pendant was forged centuries ago to trap something dangerous. My family has spent generations guarding it, making sure it stayed locked away. Why? What is it?" His expression darkened. "A shadow. A predator. Something that feeds on fear and grows stronger the more you're afraid of it." Sophia's grip tightened on the pendant as another growl echoed through the alley, closer this time. "And you're telling me this thing is alive?" "It's not just alive," he said, his voice low. "It's hunting you now." Her breath caught. She wanted to argue, to tell him how insane this all sounded, but the weight of his words settled in her chest like stone. Her hands trembled slightly, and she forced herself to meet his gaze. "What do I do?" she whispered. The man stepped closer, his expression softening just enough to reveal a hint of something she couldn't quite name, pity, perhaps, or guilt. "You stay close to me. I know how to fight it." "Who even are you?" "Elias," he said simply. "And trust me when I say I'm the only thing standing between you and whatever that thing wants to do to you." Before she could respond, the shadows around them rippled, and Sophia felt a chill race down her spine. She turned, her eyes widening as she saw something shift at the far end of the alley, a darkness that seemed to writhe and pulse, too fluid to be a solid shape, yet unmistakably alive. Elias grabbed her arm. "Run!" They bolted, Sophia's heart pounding as they darted through the narrow streets. The thing in the shadows followed, its presence pressing against her like icy fingers clawing at her skin. She could feel it gaining, and no matter how fast they ran, the oppressive weight of it didn't lessen. Elias veered suddenly, yanking her into a side street that opened into a quiet courtyard. He shoved her behind him and turned to face the alley they had just come from. "Stay back," he said, his voice low but firm. Sophia clutched the pendant, her breaths ragged. "What are you going to do?" Elias didn't answer. Instead, he pulled something from his coat, a blade, slender and silver, its edge glinting faintly in the moonlight. The darkness spilled into the courtyard, pooling like ink across the cobblestones. It coalesced into a shape vaguely humanoid, but twisted and wrong. Its eyes burned with an eerie crimson light, and its mouth, if it could be called that, stretched wide into something that looked far too much like a grin. Elias didn't wait for it to strike. He lunged, the blade flashing as he slashed at the creature. It shrieked a high, piercing sound that sent Sophia reeling and recoiled, its form rippling as though trying to reform. "Stay back." Elias barked over his shoulder as he pressed the attack. Sophia didn't need to be told twice. She backed away until her shoulders hit the rough brick of the courtyard wall, her eyes locked on the battle in front of her. Elias moved with a speed and precision that didn't seem entirely human, his blade slicing through the creature's shadowy form with brutal efficiency. But the creature wasn't finished. It surged forward, its claws swiping at Elias, forcing him to stumble back. For a moment, its gaze shifted to Sophia, and she felt an icy grip tighten around her chest. The pendant grew warm in her hand. Instinctively, she raised it, clutching the crescent moon as if it could somehow shield her. The warmth turned to heat, and a faint glow emanated from the pendant, soft but unmistakable. The creature recoiled, letting out a snarl as the light touched it. Elias glanced back, his eyes widening slightly. "Hold it up," he shouted. "Don't let it get near you." Sophia obeyed, lifting the pendant higher. The glow intensified, and the creature writhed, its form breaking apart like smoke in the wind. With one final, ear-splitting shriek, it dissolved, leaving nothing but an eerie silence in its wake. Sophia sank to her knees, her chest heaving. Elias approached her slowly, his blade still in hand. "Are you okay?" She nodded weakly, though her entire body felt like it was trembling. What just happened? Elias knelt beside her, his expression grim. "That was only a fragment of what's coming," he said. "And now it knows exactly where to find you." Sophia looked down at the glowing pendant in her hand, a knot of fear tightening in her stomach. What have I done? Chapter 3, Whispers in the Night. The drive home was a blur. Sophia sat in the passenger seat of Elias's car, gripping the crescent pendant so tightly that the chain bit into her palm. Outside, the streets of Charleston passed in streaks of dim orange light and shadow, the city strangely quiet. Elias didn't say much, his knuckles tight on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed ahead. She wanted to ask 100 questions. Why had the pendant glowed? Why did that thing recoil from her? What exactly had she unleashed? But her throat felt too dry, and the weight of what had just happened pressed down on her like an anchor. The car came to a halt in front of her apartment building, a modest brick structure framed by sagging oaks and wrought iron balconies. She turned to Elias, still clutching the pendant. "What now?" Her voice came out quieter than she'd intended, but she didn't bother correcting it. Elias glanced at her, his gray eyes unreadable. "Stay inside, don't open the door for anyone, and don't take that thing off." Sophia blinked. "That's it. Stay inside and hope I don't get attacked again." For now, yes. His tone left no room for argument, though the flicker of regret in his eyes softened the blow. "I need to figure out exactly how strong this thing is now that it's loose. The pendant still holds some power. It should keep you safe for a little while." Sophia bit her lip. Part of her wanted to demand he stay, that he tell her everything and not leave her alone with whatever she'd gotten herself into. But another part of her, the part that was still reeling from the weight of the night, just wanted to collapse in her bed and pretend none of this had happened. "Fine," she said finally, pushing the door open. She stepped onto the curb, then turned back. "You'll come back, right? You're not just leaving me to deal with this on my own." Elias hesitated, his gaze softening. "I'll come back, I promise." It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her moving. She nodded and headed for the door, the pendant still warm against her palm. The apartment was silent when she stepped inside, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the stillness. Sophia flicked on a light and locked the door behind her, flipping the deadbolt for good measure. She dropped her bag by the couch and sank into the cushions, staring at the pendant in her hand. It looked so ordinary now, the crescent moon cool and still against her skin. How could something so small hold something so dangerous? Her thoughts spiraled as the events of the night replayed in her mind: the shadows, the growls, the way Elias had fought like someone who'd done it 100 times before. And then there was the way the pendant had glowed, the heat of it pulsing in her hand as if it had a life of its own. "What are you?" she whispered, holding the pendant up to the light. It didn't answer, of course, but a faint shimmer rippled across its surface, as if in response. Sophia shivered and set it down on the coffee table, pulling a blanket around her shoulders. She tried to tell herself she'd feel better in the morning, that maybe Elias was wrong, and this was all some horrible misunderstanding. But then the whispers started. She wasn't sure how long she'd been asleep when the sound pulled her from her dreams. It was faint at first, barely louder than the rustle of leaves in the wind. But as she sat up, heart pounding, the whispers grew louder. They weren't coming from the walls or the street outside, they were in her head. Sophia clutched the blanket tightly, her breath hitching as the voices grew clearer. They spoke in a language she didn't understand, the words lilting and strange, but the tone was unmistakable, cold and mocking. Her gaze darted to the coffee table. The pendant was glowing faintly, the crescent moon casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. "What do you want?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The whispers stopped. The silence was almost worse, heavy and expectant, pressing down on her until she felt like she couldn't breathe. She reached for the pendant with shaking hands, the heat of it flaring as her fingers brushed the surface. And then, the shadows in the room shifted. Sophia froze as the darkness pooled in the far corner of the room, deepening into a shape of figure. It was taller than any person, its form hazy and insubstantial, but its eyes burned red like coals, cutting through the darkness. Her instinct was to scream, but the sound caught in her throat as the figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. "You took what wasn't yours," it said, its voice low and guttural, echoing in her mind as much as in the room. Sophia's grip on the pendant tightened. "I didn't know," she stammered. "I didn't mean to. Meaning doesn't matter," the shadow growled. "You broke the seal. You set me free." The heat from the pendant surged, burning her hand. Sophia cried out, but she didn't let go. "What do you want from me?" The creature leaned closer, its red eyes narrowing. "You carry the mark now," it hissed. "You belong to me." Sophia's vision blurred as panic clawed at her chest. The pendant's glow intensified, filling the room with a pale silver light. The creature recoiled, its form rippling as the light touched it. "This isn't over," it snarled before dissolving into the shadows once more. The room was silent again. Sophia collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. Her hand throbbed where the pendant had burned her, and when she looked down, she saw it a faint crescent-shaped mark etched into her palm, glowing faintly before fading away. Tears pricked her eyes as the weight of the moment crashed over her. Whatever she'd unleashed wasn't going to stop. And she wasn't sure if she could survive it. Chapter 4, A Dangerous Connection. Sophia didn't sleep. She sat on the couch, knees pulled to her chest, the pendant clutched tightly in her hand. The faint, silvery mark on her palm still tingled, a constant reminder of what had happened. Every creak of the old apartment, every whisper of the wind against the windows made her jump. By the time the first rays of dawn filtered through the blinds, she was raw with exhaustion. But the fear hadn't ebbed, not even slightly. Whatever had come into her apartment last night wasn't gone, it was waiting. Watching. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking the silence. She grabbed it, hoping it was Elias, but the screen only showed a text from her best friend, Maddie. "Hey, you okay? You never texted back last night. Drinks tonight?" Sophia stared at the message, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. How was she supposed to explain any of this? That her life had gone from mundane to something out of a horror movie in less than 24 hours. She typed out a quick reply, not feeling great. Rain check. Her thumb hesitated over the send button. Maddie would ask questions, and she didn't have answers, at least not ones that wouldn't sound insane. She pressed send anyway. Before she could put the phone down, a knock echoed through the apartment. Sophia froze, her breath catching in her throat. Another knock. "It's me," a voice called. "Elias." Sophia let out a shaky breath and hurried to the door, pausing just long enough to check the peephole. Sure enough, Elias stood there, his hair a little messier than it had been last night, dark circles under his piercing gray eyes. She unlocked the door and pulled it open. "You're late," she said, the words sharper than she'd intended. Elias raised an eyebrow. Good morning to you, too. Sophia stepped aside to let him in, closing the door behind him. Something came into my apartment last night, she blurted. He stopped mid-step, his body going rigid. What? I don't know what it was, but it was here. It spoke to me. Elias turned to face her fully, his expression darkening. What did it say? Sophia hesitated, the memory of the creature's words sending a shiver down her spine. It said I belong to it, that I have the mark now. Elias swore under his breath, running a hand through his hair. The mark showed up already. She held up her palm, the faint crescent shape barely visible now, but Elias didn't need to see it to believe her. His jaw clenched and he muttered another curse. What does it mean? Sophia asked, her voice rising. What is this thing? What does it want from me? Elias paced to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer outside. The mark means it's connected to you now. The pendant didn't just release it, it tied the two of you together. Sophia felt her stomach drop. Tied, like how? He turned back to her, his expression unreadable. It means it can find you. No matter where you go, no matter what you do, it'll always be able to track you. And if it grows strong enough, he didn't finish the sentence, but Sophia could fill in the blank. Her legs felt weak, and she sank onto the edge of the couch. So what am I supposed to do? Just wait for it to kill me. Elias crouched in front of her, his intense gaze locking onto hers. No, I won't let that happen. The pendant's power is still linked to you too. That's why it reacted last night, it was protecting you. But its power is limited, especially now that the seal is broken. Sophia looked down at the pendant in her hand, its delicate crescent shape gleaming faintly in the morning light. It seemed impossible that something so small could hold any kind of power, let alone enough to keep her alive. Then how do we stop it? She asked softly. Elias hesitated, his jaw tightening. That's complicated. Sophia's frustration boiled over. I don't have time for complicated, Elias. This thing wants to kill me, and you're the one who dragged me into this, so start talking. His eyes flashed, but he didn't snap back at her. Instead, he stood, rubbing a hand over his face. Fine, there are two ways to end this. The first is to kill the shadow. Sophia's heart skipped a beat. That's possible. Technically, yes, Elias said, but it's not easy. Shadows like this one don't just die, they have to be destroyed completely, and that takes power. More than I have right now. Her stomach sank. And the other way, Elias's expression darkened further, and for a moment he didn't answer. Finally, he looked at her, his voice low and cautious. The other way is to rebind it to the pendant. But to do that he trailed off, his gaze flicking to her hand. What? Sophia pressed. To do that, what? Elias sighed, his shoulders slumping. It requires the person tied to the shadow to willingly give up a part of themselves. Their strength, their energy. It's dangerous and it's permanent. Sophia stared at him, her mind reeling. And by the person tied to it, you mean me. Yes, Elias said grimly. The room fell silent. Sophia's thoughts raced, colliding with each other in a frantic jumble. She'd been thrown into this mess without warning, without choice, and now she was supposed to risk her life to fix it. No, she said finally, shaking her head. There has to be another way. If there was, I'd tell you, Elias said. His voice was softer now, almost gentle. But this thing, it's not just some monster. It's ancient. It feeds on fear, and the longer it's free, the stronger it'll get. If we don't stop it, it won't just come for you. It'll go after anyone it can get to. Sophia closed her eyes, the weight of his words settling on her like a crushing tide. She didn't ask for this. She didn't deserve this. But it didn't matter, did it? The mark on her palm, the shadow in her apartment, the pendant in her hand, it all tied her to this thing now, whether she liked it or not. Finally, she looked up at Elias, her chest tightening. If we try to kill it, what are the odds we succeed? Elias hesitated, and that was all the answer she needed. Chapter 5, Secrets of the Crescent. Sophia sat at her kitchen table, the pendant resting in the center like a ticking time bomb. It caught the sunlight streaming through the window, glinting in a way that felt almost mocking. Elias leaned against the counter, his arms crossed, watching her carefully. He hadn't spoken much since their conversation, but his presence was heavy, like he was waiting for her to break under the pressure of the decision she didn't know how to make. "I can't just sit here," Sophia said finally, breaking the tense silence. "You told me what I'm up against, but you didn't tell me how to prepare. If I'm stuck with this thing, I need to understand it." Elias tilted his head, his gray eyes narrowing. "What exactly do you mean?" "I mean I'm not going to be some helpless victim waiting for the next attack," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "If there's information out there about this pendant, about the shadow, then I need to find it. There has to be something, some history, some record, right?" Elias hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. "There are pieces of information," he said carefully, "but most of it isn't exactly accessible. What do you think you're going to find in the Charleston Public Library? A book called How to Survive an Ancient Curse." Sophia shot him a glare. "I don't know. Maybe. But if you've got something better, now would be a great time to share." For a moment he just stared at her, as though weighing whether to argue. Then he sighed and pushed off the counter. "Fine. There's someone who might be able to help, someone who knows more about the pendant than I do." Sophia straightened. "Who?" An old historian, Elias said reluctantly. "He specializes in artifacts like this." "I've gone to him a few times in the past." Her eyebrows shot up. "You're just now telling me this? Why didn't we go to him yesterday?" "Because he's particular about who he helps," Elias said. "And he won't just tell you what you want to know. He'll want something in return." Sophia frowned. "Like what?" "It depends. Information, a favor, something you might not want to give." His expression darkened. "And if he thinks you're wasting his time, he won't hesitate to turn you away." Sophia let out a breath, her determination wavering. "But he might know how to stop this thing. If anyone does, it's him," Elias said. Sophia swallowed hard, nodding. "Then let's go." The historian's shop was tucked into an unassuming corner of Charleston, hidden between a boarded-up bookstore and a cafe that smelled overwhelmingly of coffee beans and cinnamon. The sign above the door read Hawthorne Co., Antiquities, but the windows were dark, and there was no indication it was even open. "This is it?" Sophia asked, staring at the chipped paint on the doorframe. Elias nodded. "Don't let the looks fool you. He knows what he's doing." He knocked twice, then paused. A few seconds later, a narrow slot in the door slid open, revealing a pair of sharp blue eyes. "What do you want?" the man behind the door asked brusquely. Elias leaned closer. "It's me, Elias." The slot snapped shut, and there was a sound of locks being undone. The door creaked open to reveal a tall, wiry man in his 60s, his silver hair tied back in a loose ponytail. He wore a rumpled button-down shirt and glasses that hung from a cord around his neck. "You again," the man said, his voice tinged with annoyance. "Didn't I tell you not to bother me unless it was life or death?" "It is," Elias said simply, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Sophia hesitated but followed, feeling the man's sharp gaze sweep over her as she passed. The inside of the shop was a maze of shelves crammed with everything from ancient-looking scrolls to rusted weapons. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and dust, and the dim lighting made the space feel even more cramped. The man Hawthorne, Sophia assumed, shut the door behind them and crossed his arms. "All right. What's the crisis this time?" Elias gestured toward Sophia. She touched the crescent pendant. Hawthorne's expression froze. For a moment, he didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at Sophia as though she'd said something truly unforgivable. Then he exhaled sharply and walked to the counter, pulling open a drawer filled with what looked like old files. "Why am I not surprised?" he muttered under his breath, rifling through the papers. "And let me guess, the shadow's loose." Sophia nodded, feeling oddly like a child being scolded by a teacher. "It came after me last night," she said. Hawthorne shot her a look. "Of course it did. That's what happens when you break a binding seal. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I didn't know," she protested. "I didn't even know it was real until it attacked me." Hawthorne didn't seem impressed by her defense. He pulled a folder from the drawer and slapped it onto the counter. "The crescent pendant is one of the oldest cursed artifacts still in existence," he said, flipping through the papers. Its origins are debated, but the most reliable accounts trace it back to a group of ancient priests who used it to trap something they couldn't kill. A shadow creature. A predator. Why couldn't they kill it? Sophia asked, leaning closer. Hawthorne glanced at her. Because it's not entirely of this world. Shadows like this one don't obey the same rules we do. You can weaken them, slow them down, even bind them like the priests did, but destroy them. No one's ever figured out how. Sophia's stomach twisted. So what am I supposed to do? That depends on how far you're willing to go, Hawthorne said, his gaze shifting to Elias. You didn't tell her about the choice, did you? Elias's jaw tightened. She knows. Good. Hawthorne turned back to Sophia, his expression grim. Then you understand what's at stake. If you're not strong enough to stop it, the shadow will grow stronger. It'll kill you and anyone else it decides is worth its attention. Sophia swallowed hard, her chest tightening. There has to be another way, she said, her voice shaking. Hawthorne tilted his head, studying her. There might be, he said slowly, but it'll take more than what you've got now. You'll need to fight it on its terms, and that means understanding its nature, its weaknesses, and yours. Sophia blinked. How do I do that? He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You don't just fight shadows, Miss Adler, you step into them. But once you do, there's no turning back. Chapter 6. The marked ones. The world outside Hawthorne's shop felt sharper, colder, as though the very air carried the weight of what Sophia had just learned. The streets of Charleston buzzed with their usual rhythm, tourists snapping photos, cafe patrons chatting over coffee, but the city's normalcy felt like a fragile facade. Sophia walked beside Elias, her steps slower than usual, her thoughts tangled. She kept her hand tucked in her pocket, fingers brushing the faint crescent mark on her palm. Hawthorne's words echoed in her mind. You don't just fight shadows, you step into them. What did he mean by that? She asked finally, breaking the silence. Elias glanced at her. He meant it literally. Sophia stopped, forcing him to turn back toward her. You're saying I'm supposed to what? Dive into some shadowy void and hope I don't die? His expression was grim. It's not exactly like that, but close enough. The shadow doesn't just exist in our world, it straddles the line between here and something darker. If you're going to fight it, you'll need to step into that space. Her stomach churned. And you just expect me to do that? To walk into some nightmare dimension like it's no big deal? I don't expect anything, Elias said, his voice tight. But if you don't, the shadow will keep getting stronger. You've seen what it can do already, and that's just the beginning. Sophia clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. Why me? She asked, her voice breaking. I didn't ask for this. I didn't choose to be a part of whatever this is. I know, Elias said softly, and if I could take this from you, I would. But it doesn't work like that. The mark chose you the moment you touched the pendant. Her chest tightened. She wanted to scream, to demand that anyone fix this for her. But deep down, she knew Elias was right. The shadow wasn't going to stop, and no one else could carry this burden for her. Fine, she said finally, her voice trembling. If I have to do this, then I need to know everything. No more half-truths, no more vague warnings. I want the full story. Elias hesitated, his jaw tightening, but then he nodded. Okay, we'll start with the mark. Back at Sophia's apartment, the tension was palpable. She sat at the edge of the couch while Elias stood by the window, his gaze scanning the street outside as if expecting the shadow to appear at any moment. The mark is more than just a connection to the shadow, Elias began. It's also a doorway. The shadow can use it to track you, to reach for you, but it's a two-way street. If you're strong enough, you can use the mark to find it, to step into its world. Sophia's stomach twisted. You keep saying if you're strong enough, what happens if I'm not? Elias didn't answer immediately. His silence was answer enough. Sophia swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing down on her. Have other people done this before? Not many, Elias admitted. Most people who have been marked don't last long enough to try. The shadow feeds on fear, and fear is hard to fight. But the ones who have survived, he trailed off, his expression unreadable. What? Sophia pressed. They're not the same afterward, he said finally. Stepping into the shadows world changes you. It leaves a mark, just like the pendant did. And once you cross that line, there's no going back. Sophia stared at him, her pulse pounding in her ears. Have you ever done it? Elias's jaw tightened. Yes, she blinked, startled by his honesty. What happened? He didn't look at her as he spoke. It was years ago. A different pendant, a different shadow. My brother was the one who was marked, but he couldn't fight it on his own. I stepped in to help him, and he paused, his voice faltering for the first time. I got him out. But the shadow didn't let me leave unscathed. Sophia's heart ached at the pain in his voice. What did it do to you? Elias turned to face her, his gray eyes shadowed. It left something behind, a piece of itself. That's why I can sense them now, why I know how to fight them. But it's also why they're drawn to me. Sophia felt a lump rise in her throat. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected him to share something so raw, so personal. I'm sorry, she said softly. He shook his head. Don't be. It's why I'm still alive, why I can help you. Sophia glanced down at her marked palm. Do you think I can do it? Survive, I mean. Elias crouched in front of her, his gaze steady. I think you're stronger than you realize, he said. But this isn't just about surviving. If you go into the shadows world, you'll need to face it. And that means facing every fear, every doubt, every weakness it can pull out of you. Sophia's breath hitched. The idea of stepping into that darkness, of confronting whatever horrors it held, made her blood run cold. But the alternative, letting the shadow grow stronger, letting it destroy everything in its path, was worse. Okay, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Tell me how to do it. The training began that night. Elias insisted on starting with meditation, a practice that felt laughable at first. The shadow feeds on fear, he explained, sitting cross-legged across from her on the floor. The more control you have over your emotions, the harder it'll be for it to manipulate you. Sophia struggled to keep her mind focused. Every time she closed her eyes, images of the shadow flashed behind her eyelids, its glowing red eyes, its twisted grin. You're overthinking, Elias said, his voice calm but firm. Don't fight the fear. Acknowledge it and then let it go. That's easy for you to say, Sophia muttered, her fists clenching. You're not the one who's I've done this before, Elias interrupted, his voice sharper than before. I know exactly what it feels like. The fear doesn't go away, Sophia. You just learn how to live with it. His words struck a chord. She took a shaky breath and tried again, focusing on the steady rhythm of her breathing, the weight of the pendant in her hand. Slowly, the tension in her shoulders eased, and for the first time in days, she felt a flicker of calm. When she opened her eyes, Elias was watching her, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. You're getting there, he said. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Chapter 7, A Wolf in the Shadows. The first night of training had been the calm before the storm. Sophia woke the next morning to a pounding headache and the lingering weight of her nightmares, dreams of the shadow stalking her through endless corridors, its red eyes always just behind her. She stumbled into the kitchen, where Elias was already pouring coffee, looking infuriatingly composed. You look like hell, he said, sliding a mug toward her. Sophia glared at him as she sat down. Gee, thanks, really needed the confidence boost. You're going to need more than confidence, Elias said, sitting across from her. Last night was just the first step. Meditation helps you hold your ground, but if the shadow comes for you again, you'll need to do more than sit still. Sophia took a sip of coffee, wincing at the bitterness. Like what? You want me to punch it? Elias's lips twitched in a faint smile. If only it were that simple. You're not fighting something you can touch, its fear, anger, and despair made real. But that doesn't mean you're powerless. He leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. The pendant is the key. It carries the remnants of the seal that bound the shadow. If you can tap into that power, you can weaken it, maybe even force it to retreat. Sophia frowned, glancing down at the crescent moon hanging around her neck. It looked so small, so ordinary, but she remembered the way it had glowed when the shadow attacked. How do I tap into it? Elias hesitated, his gray eyes darkening. That's what we're going to figure out, but I'll warn you it's not going to be easy. The pendant reacts to your emotions, your intent. If you let fear or doubt take over, it'll shut you out. Great, Sophia muttered, staring into her coffee. So no pressure or anything. By the time the sun began to set, Sophia was already exhausted. Elias had pushed her through hours of mental and physical exercises, each one designed to test her focus and resilience. They practiced in the courtyard behind her apartment building, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine. Again, Elias said, his voice steady but firm. Sophia gritted her teeth, holding the pendant tightly in her hand. She closed her eyes, focusing on the flicker of warmth she could feel beneath her fingertips. Her breathing slowed, her mind sharpening as she visualized the crescent moon glowing brighter, stronger. For a moment, she felt the faint hum of energy, the warmth spreading through her hand. But as soon as she tried to push it further, the memory of the shadow's red eyes surfaced, and the connection shattered. She gasped, her knees buckling as the pendant went cold in her hand. Elias caught her before she hit the ground, steadying her with one arm. "You're letting it in," he said, his tone more gentle than before. "You can't fight fear by pretending it's not there. You have to face it." Sophia nodded weakly, wiping sweat from her forehead. "Easy for you to say," she muttered. He helped her back to her feet, his expression unreadable. "Take a break. We'll try again later." That night, Sophia sat by the window, staring out at the city lights. The pendant rested against her chest, its cool weight a constant reminder of everything she'd learned and everything she still didn't understand. Her mind drifted back to what Hawthorne had said, about stepping into the shadows to truly face the creature. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before she'd have to do just that. The thought sent a chill down her spine. A sudden movement in the street below caught her attention. She leaned closer to the window, her pulse quickening as she spotted a figure standing beneath the street lamp. It was too far away to make out any details, but something about the way it stood still and tense, as though watching, made her stomach twist. "Elias," she called, her voice trembling. He appeared a moment later, his expression instantly shifting to alertness when he saw her face. "What is it?" Sophia pointed toward the street. "Someone's down there. I think they're watching us." Elias frowned, stepping closer to the window. He squinted into the darkness, then cursed under his breath. "It's not someone," he said grimly. "It's something." Sophia's blood ran cold. The shadow? No, Elias's jaw tightened. "This is different." Before she could ask what he meant, the figure moved, stepping into the light. For a moment, Sophia thought it was a man tall, broad-shouldered, wearing dark clothing. But then she saw the glint of eyes that weren't human, the way its movements were too fluid, too animalistic. And then it growled. "Get away from the window," Elias ordered, pulling her back. "What is it?" Sophia asked, her voice shaking. Elias didn't answer immediately. He reached for the blade he always kept strapped to his side, his grip tightening around the hilt. "It's a wolf," he said finally. "Or at least that's what it wants you to think." Sophia's heart pounded. "What does that mean? Is it working with the shadow?" "No," Elias said, his eyes narrowing. "Wolves don't work with anyone, but they're drawn to power, just like the shadow. And if it's here, it means it's hunting something." Sophia's stomach twisted. "Me?" Elias glanced at her, his expression hard. "Stay here," he said, moving toward the door. "Wait, you're going out there." Sophia grabbed his arm, panic rising in her chest. "What if it's dangerous?" Elias gave her a wry smile. "It is dangerous. That's why I'm going. Stay inside and don't open the door for anyone but me." Before she could argue, he slipped out the door, leaving her alone in the dimly lit apartment. Sophia paced the living room, her nerves fraying with each passing minute. The growls and snarls she'd heard earlier had gone silent, and the stillness was somehow worse. She gripped the pendant, willing it to give her some kind of reassurance, but it remained cold and inert. Just as she was about to call Elias's name, the door opened and he stepped inside, his shirt torn and his knuckles bloodied. "What happened?" she asked, rushing to him. He shook his head, his breathing heavy. "It wasn't alone. There were more of them. Wolves, something like that," Elias said grimly, "and they're not going to stop. Whatever you unleashed, it's drawing them here like a beacon. Sophia's hands trembled as she clutched the pendant. What do they want? Elias's expression darkened. The same thing the shadow wants. You. Chapter 8. Bound by blood, the air in the apartment felt oppressive, thick with tension. Sophia stared at Elias, her mind struggling to process his words. You, why did it always come back to her? The wolves, the shadow, everything seemed to be circling closer, like she was some kind of magnet for chaos. Elias walked to the sink, running water over his bloodied knuckles. His movements were deliberate, calm even, but the tightness in his jaw betrayed his frustration. Sophia stood frozen, watching the faint pink water swirl down the drain. You need to explain this, she said finally, her voice trembling. What are they? Why do they want me? Elias grabbed a towel, wiping his hands dry before turning to face her. They're not wolves in the way you're thinking, he said. They're shapeshifters, tied to old magic that's been twisted over centuries. They hunt power and they're territorial. The shadow's presence has drawn them here, but it's you they've locked onto. Sophia crossed her arms, trying to ignore the way her chest tightened with fear. Why me? I didn't ask for any of this. It doesn't matter if you asked for it, Elias said, his voice sharp. The moment you touched that pendant, it marked you. You're carrying the shadow's power now, even if you don't realize it. To them, you're either a threat or a prize. Sophia swallowed hard, her mind spinning. She leaned against the counter, her fingers gripping the edge as she tried to steady herself. So what happens if they get to me? Are they going to kill me or no? Elias said quickly, cutting her off. Not kill, but they might try to use you to siphon the shadow's power for themselves. Sophia stared at him, dread pooling in her stomach. Use me how? His gaze dropped to the pendant around her neck. You don't want to know. Her stomach churned, but she forced herself to stand straighter. Okay, so what do we do? How do we stop them? Elias hesitated, his expression unreadable. We need to put distance between you and them. You're not safe here anymore. If they've found you once, they'll find you again. Sophia's heart sank. You want me to leave? Where am I supposed to go? Somewhere they won't expect, Elias said. I know places we can hide, places where the wolves won't follow. Sophia stared at him, her fear and frustration bubbling to the surface. So I'm just supposed to abandon my life, my home. What about Maddie? What about my job? Elias's eyes softened, but his voice remained firm. You don't have a choice, Sophia. If you stay, they'll come for you. And if the shadow finds you before we're ready, nothing else will matter. Her chest tightened, tears stinging her eyes. She hated the way his words made sense, hated that her life was unraveling faster than she could hold it together. Fine, she said, her voice shaky. But I'm not leaving without answers. If I'm giving up everything, I need to know what I'm fighting for. Elias nodded, his expression grim. Fair enough, but we need to move now. Pack a bag. Essentials only. Sophia turned toward her bedroom, her hands shaking as she grabbed a duffel bag from the closet. She shoved clothes inside without thinking, her mind racing. They were on the road an hour later, the city lights fading in the rearview mirror as Elias drove them toward the outskirts of Charleston. The highway stretched out before them, empty and dark, the hum of the engine the only sound. Sophia stared out the window, the pendant warm against her chest. She couldn't stop thinking about the wolves, about the way they'd moved in the street, their eyes glinting with something too intelligent, too predatory. Where are we going? She asked finally, breaking the silence. There's an old safe house about an hour from here, Elias said. It belonged to my family. No one knows about it, and the wards should keep them out for now. Wards? Sophia asked, frowning. Protective magic, Elias explained. My family used them to keep the pendant and the things it attracted hidden. They won't hold forever, but they'll buy us time. Sophia leaned back in her seat, her mind spinning with questions. You keep talking about your family. What happened to them? Elias's hands tightened on the wheel, his jaw clenching. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer, but then he spoke, his voice low. They're gone. The last of them died years ago, fighting something like this. After that, it was just me. Sophia's chest tightened. I'm sorry, she said softly. Elias shrugged, his eyes fixed on the road. It's not your fault. This life doesn't leave much room for happy endings. They drove in silence after that, the weight of his words settling heavily between them. The safe house was nothing like Sophia had expected. It was a small, weathered cabin tucked deep into the woods, surrounded by towering pines and thick underbrush. The air was cool and damp, the ground littered with fallen leaves. Elias parked the car and stepped out, scanning the area before motioning for Sophia to follow. "This place looks rustic," she said, trying to hide her unease as she stepped onto the porch. "It's secure," Elias said simply, unlocking the door. Inside, the cabin was surprisingly clean, with sturdy furniture and a stone fireplace that looked like it had been recently used. There were shelves filled with books and jars, and a faint scent of cedar lingered in the air. Sophia set her bag down and turned to Elias. "Now what?" "Now we fortify the wards," Elias said, heading toward one of the bookshelves. He pulled out a thick, leather-bound book and began flipping through the pages. "And then we figure out what the wolves want and how to stop them before they force your hand." Sophia frowned. "Force my hand? What do you mean?" Elias glanced at her, his expression grim. "If they can't take the shadow's power from you, they might try to force you to use it to summon the shadow directly." Her blood ran cold. "And if that happens?" Elias's voice was quiet, but the weight of it was crushing. "If that happens, Sophia, it's over for all of us." Chapter 9. The Pax warning the safe house was eerily quiet. The kind of silence that made every creak of the floorboards and rustle of leaves outside feel louder than it should have. Sophia sat on the worn couch near the fireplace, watching Elias as he worked. He moved with practiced efficiency, marking symbols on the windowsills with chalk and muttering words she didn't understand. The air inside the cabin shifted as he finished each ward. Sophia couldn't explain how, but she felt the difference like the space itself was holding its breath, waiting. "Will they really stay out?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "They'll try to break through," Elias said, crouched by the front door as he etched the final symbol into the wood. "But these wards are old. They were made for this kind of threat." He straightened, brushing chalk dust from his hands. "It won't stop them forever, but it'll give us time." Sophia leaned back, clutching the pendant in her hand. "Time for what?" Elias turned to her, his gray eyes serious. "For you to get stronger." Her stomach twisted at the implication, but before she could respond, the wind outside shifted. It howled through the trees, carrying a sound that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end, a low, mournful howl that sent a chill through her entire body. Elias froze, his head tilting slightly as he listened. "They're here." Sophia's heart pounded as she scrambled to her feet. "What do we do?" Elias grabbed his blade from the counter, the silver edge gleaming in the dim light. "Stay inside. No matter what you hear, no matter what happens, you don't open that door." "And what about you?" Sophia demanded, panic rising in her chest. "I'm not going far," Elias said, his tone firm but calm. "I just need to make sure they don't get too close to the cabin." Before she could argue, he was out the door, leaving her standing alone in the middle of the room. The moment the door shut, the howling intensified, joined by snarls and growls that seemed to come from every direction. Sophia backed away from the windows, her hands shaking. She tried to focus on her breathing, on the pendant in her hand, but her mind kept racing back to what Elias had said earlier about the wolves wanting to use her, about the shadow growing stronger. A sharp knock at the door shattered her thoughts. Sophia froze, her breath hitching. Another knock, louder this time. "Open the door, Sophia," a voice called from outside. It was low and smooth, with an edge that sent a shiver down her spine. She backed further away, clutching the pendant tightly. "No," she said, her voice trembling. The voice chuckled. "Smart girl. But you can't stay in there forever." Sophia's pulse raced as shadows flickered outside the windows. She couldn't see them clearly, but the movement was unmistakable figures pacing just beyond the reach of the cabin's light. "We don't have to be enemies," the voice continued. "You're carrying something powerful, something the world hasn't seen in centuries. Do you even understand what it is?" Sophia's fingers tightened around the crescent moon. "I know enough to stay away from you." Another chuckle, darker this time. Do you? Because if you understood the shadow's power, you wouldn't be hiding. You'd be using it. You could end this game in a heartbeat. Leave me alone. Sophia shouted, her voice cracking. The voice dropped to a near whisper, smooth and insidious. You can feel it, can't you? The power in your veins. It's not fear, it's hunger. The shadow is part of you now. The longer you ignore it, the stronger it will become. And when it finally takes over, the voice trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Sophia's knees felt weak, her back pressing against the far wall as the pendant began to warm in her hand. She forced herself to take deep breaths, to focus on the faint pulse of energy in the crescent moon. Another growl rumbled outside, followed by a snarl and the sound of scuffling. Sophia's heart lurched as she realized what it meant. Elias. The growling grew louder, more violent, and she could hear the sharp clash of claws against metal. Her instincts screamed at her to run to the door to help him, but his warning echoed in her mind, stay inside. No matter what happens. Minutes passed like hours as the sounds of the fight raged outside. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it went quiet. Sophia held her breath, straining to hear any sign of movement. The silence was suffocating, heavy with dread. The door creaked open. Sophia's heart jumped into her throat as Elias stepped inside, blood smeared across his face and shirt. His blade was still in his hand, dark streaks staining the silver edge. They're gone, he said, his voice hoarse. What happened? Sophia asked, rushing to him. They were testing the wards, Elias said, leaning against the doorframe, trying to find a weak spot. They won't stop, Sophia, not until they get what they came for. She swallowed hard, her fear twisting into something sharper, anger. Then we make them stop. Elias studied her, his gray eyes narrowing. That's not how this works. If we go after them head on, we're playing their game. We have to be smarter than that. Sophia clenched her fists, the crescent-shaped mark on her palm faintly tingling. Then what do? Elias hesitated, his expression grim. We find out who's leading them. Wolves like this don't act without a purpose. Someone sent them after you, and if we can figure out who or what it is, we might stand a chance. Sophia nodded, her fear hardening into determination. She didn't know how they were going to fight this, but one thing was certain: she wasn't going to run anymore. Chapter 10, under the blood moon, the moon hung low in the night sky, its crimson hue casting an eerie glow over the forest surrounding the safe house. The air was colder than it had been earlier, heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine. Sophia stood on the porch, the pendant in her hand, staring out into the darkness. Elias was inside, tending to the gash on his shoulder from the earlier fight. He had insisted she stay near the cabin, but her mind was restless, a storm of thoughts and emotions she couldn't untangle. The wolves weren't just mindless predators, they had a leader. Someone who had sent them, someone who wanted her. And the shadow's whispers still lingered in the back of her mind, quiet but insistent. You're stronger than this. You're meant for more. Sophia tightened her grip on the pendant. The faint warmth pulsing from the crescent moon was the only thing grounding her, keeping her fear from swallowing her whole. The cabin door creaked open behind her. You shouldn't be out here alone, Elias said, stepping onto the porch. His shirt was torn where the wolf's claws had raked across his shoulder, but he looked steady, his gray eyes sharp and watchful. I can't just sit inside and pretend everything's fine, Sophia said without looking at him. Not when I know they're still out there. They're regrouping, Elias said, leaning against the railing. The blood moon makes them stronger, but it also makes them reckless. They'll try again before the night's over. Sophia turned to him, her frustration bubbling to the surface. Why won't they just leave me alone? If they want the shadow's power so badly, why don't they go after it directly? Because they can't, Elias said, his voice calm but firm. The shadow is tied to you now. If they want its power, they need you. Sophia felt her stomach twist, a mix of anger and fear coursing through her. So what am I supposed to do? Just wait for them to come back. No, Elias said, his gaze steady. We're going to find them first. Sophia blinked, startled. I thought you said going after them was playing their game. It is, Elias admitted. But we don't have a choice anymore. They've already made their move, and if we wait, they'll just keep coming until they wear us down. We need to take the fight to them on our terms. Sophia stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. How do we even find them? Elias hesitated, his jaw tightening. The wolves are connected to the moon. They draw their power from it, especially during nights like this. If we follow the pull of the pendant, it should lead us to them. Sophia's eyes widened. The pendant can do that. It's tied to the shadow, Elias said, and the shadow is tied to them. The connection is faint, but it's there. You just have to focus. Her chest tightened. What if it doesn't work? Elias's gaze softened. It will. You're stronger than you think, Sophia. You just have to trust yourself. Sophia swallowed hard, her heart pounding as she looked down at the pendant. She didn't feel strong. She felt like she was barely holding herself together, like the weight of everything was going to crush her at any moment. But she couldn't let that stop her. Not now. Taking a deep breath, she closed her eyes and focused on the crescent moon. The warmth she had felt earlier began to build, spreading through her hand and up her arm. She concentrated on the pull, the faint hum of energy that seemed to guide her. There, she whispered, her eyes snapping open. I can feel it. Elias nodded, his expression grim. Good. Let's go. The forest was a maze of shadows and moonlight, the crimson glow casting long, twisted shapes across the ground. Sophia followed the pull of the pendant, her steps hesitant but determined. Elias walked beside her, his blade in hand, his senses sharp and alert. Stay close to me, he said quietly. I'm not going anywhere, Sophia replied, her voice steadier than she felt. The further they went, the stronger the pull became. It wasn't just a physical sensation, it was emotional, too, a heavy, oppressive weight that pressed against her chest. Fear, anger, desperation, they all seemed to swirl together, tugging at her like a tide. Do you feel that? Sophia asked, glancing at Elias. He nodded, his jaw tight. That's them. They're close. Sophia swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. The trees thinned as they approached a clearing, the moonlight spilling over the open space like blood. And there they were. The wolves stood in the clearing, their forms shifting between human and beast. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and their movements were slow, deliberate as they turned to face Sophia and Elias. At the center of the group stood a man, his presence commanding and dangerous. His features were sharp, his dark hair slicked back, and his eyes burned with a golden intensity that sent a chill through Sophia's entire body. Welcome, the man said, his voice smooth and deep. We've been expecting you. Sophia clenched her fists, the pendant growing warm against her chest. Who are you? The man smiled, a cold, predatory grin. You can call me Lucian, he said. And you, Sophia Adler, are far more interesting than I imagined. Elias stepped in front of her, his blade glinting in the moonlight. Stay back, he warned, his voice low. Lucian chuckled, the sound dripping with amusement. Relax, Guardian. If I wanted her dead, I wouldn't have let you get this far. Sophia's heart pounded, her fear threatening to spiral out of control. What do you want from me? Lucian's gaze shifted to her, his smile fading. I want you to embrace what you are, he said simply. You're carrying a gift, Sophia, a power that could reshape the world. Don't waste it by hiding. That's not her choice, Elias growled, stepping closer. Lucian raised an eyebrow, his expression calm. Isn't it? The wolves around him growled softly, their eyes fixed on Sophia. She could feel their hunger, their need, pressing against her like a physical force. And then Lucian took a step forward, his golden eyes locking onto hers. The shadow is already part of you, he said, his voice soft but commanding. You can't fight it forever. Sooner or later it will consume you, and when that happens he smiled again, slow and deliberate. You'll come to me. The pendant flared with heat and Sophia gasped, stumbling back. Elias grabbed her arm, steadying her as Lucian's smile widened. This isn't over, he said, his voice echoing through the clearing. And then, with a flick of his hand, the wolves melted into the shadows, leaving Sophia and Elias alone beneath the blood moon. Chapter 11, a bond that burned Sophia's legs felt like jelly as she and Elias made their way back to the safe house. The forest, once ominously quiet, now seemed alive with phantom sounds, branches cracking in the distance, leaves rustling as though something unseen followed them. Every instinct in her body screamed to run, but Elias's steady presence at her side kept her from unraveling entirely. Her mind replayed the encounter with Lucien on an endless loop, his golden eyes, his calm, confident demeanor, the way he spoke as if her fate was already sealed. What did he mean? She asked, finally, breaking the heavy silence. About the shadow consuming me. Elias slowed, his expression darkening as he glanced at her. He was trying to get into your head. Sophia stopped walking, crossing her arms. That's not an answer, Elias. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. The shadow isn't just tied to you. It's inside you. The longer it's free, the stronger its influence gets. It's subtle at first, dreams, whispers, but eventually it'll start pushing harder. It'll try to take control. Sophia's chest tightened, her pulse racing. Take control, like possess me. Not exactly, Elias said, his voice low. It doesn't want to wear your skin. It wants to merge with you, to make you its host. Her stomach churned, nausea rising like a tide. And if that happens, Elias's jaw clenched, his silence saying more than words ever could. Sophia shook her head, anger and fear warring within her. You knew this was a possibility and you didn't tell me. I didn't want to scare you, Elias said, his tone hardening. And besides, it hasn't gone that far yet. The pendant is still fighting it. You're still fighting it. For how long? She demanded, her voice breaking. How long before it wins? Elias stepped closer, his gray eyes piercing. That's up to you. You're not powerless, Sophia. The shadow feeds on fear and doubt, but you're stronger than it is. You just have to believe that. Sophia wanted to argue, to tell him how wrong he was, but deep down, she knew he wasn't lying. She had felt the shadows pull its whispers in her dreams, the way it had seemed to awaken something inside her when she held the pendant. But there was also a flicker of something else, something warmer. Hope. She took a shaky breath, nodding. Okay, so what do we do now? Back at the cabin, Elias worked to reinforce the wards, his movements precise and efficient. Sophia watched him from the couch, clutching the pendant as if it were her lifeline. Her mind wandered back to Lucien. There had been something about the way he'd looked at her, something almost familiar. She couldn't explain it, but the memory of his golden eyes sent a shiver down her spine. Who is he? She asked suddenly. Elias paused, glancing over his shoulder. Lucien, Sophia nodded. Elias hesitated, as if debating how much to tell her. He's a rogue, he said finally. A wolf who broke away from his pack years ago. He's been gathering followers ever since other wolves, shapeshifters, anyone who's willing to swear loyalty to him. No one knows exactly what he's after, but one thing's clear, he's dangerous. And now he's after me, Sophia said bitterly. Elias nodded grimly. He sees you as a weapon. If he can turn you, he'll have the shadow's power on his side. That's why he's so interested in you. Sophia frowned, her fingers tracing the crescent mark on her palm. He said something about me embracing what I am. What do you think he meant? Elias's expression darkened. He wants you to give in to the shadow, to stop fighting it and let it take control. If you do that, the pendant's power will shift from a barrier to a conduit. It would amplify the shadow's strength, make it nearly unstoppable. Sophia stared at him, her stomach twisting with dread. And if I don't, if I keep fighting? Elias met her gaze, his voice low and steady. Then we find a way to destroy it, together. The next few days passed in a blur of training and preparation. Elias pushed Sophia harder than ever, forcing her to confront her fears and strengthen her connection to the pendant. They practiced in the forest near the cabin, far enough from the wards that Sophia could feel the faint, oppressive pull of the shadow. Focus, Elias said, his voice sharp. Sophia closed her eyes, the pendant warm in her hand. She could feel the shadow's presence on the edges of her awareness, dark and hungry. But she could also feel something else, a steady pulse of light deep within the crescent moon. Find the balance, Elias said. Don't let the shadow overwhelm you, but don't ignore it either. Use it. Control it. Sophia gritted her teeth, her mind straining to hold the two opposing forces in place. Sweat dripped down her forehead, but she kept pushing, reaching for the flicker of warmth in the pendant. And then, suddenly, it clicked. The pendant flared with light, a brilliant silver glow that illuminated the forest around them. Sophia gasped, stumbling back as the energy surged through her, but she didn't let go. "Good," Elias said, stepping closer. "Now hold it. Don't let it fade." Sophia focused, her breath coming in short bursts as the light steadied, its warmth spreading through her chest. For the first time, she felt in control, like the shadow wasn't just something to fear, but something she could harness. When the glow finally faded, Sophia sank to her knees, her body trembling with exhaustion. Elias crouched beside her, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You're getting stronger," he said. Sophia looked up at him, her chest tight with a mix of pride and fear. But is it enough? Elias's smile faded, his expression turning serious. "It will be. You just have to keep fighting." That night, Sophia lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the cabin. The pendant rested on her chest, its faint warmth a steady comfort. She thought about Elias, about the way he had fought for her, protected her, and believed in her even when she couldn't believe in herself. And she thought about Lucien, his golden eyes haunting her dreams, his words echoing in her mind. "You'll come to me." Sophia clenched her fists, her determination hardening. She didn't know how this would end, but one thing was clear: she wasn't going to let Lucien, the wolves, or the shadow control her. This fight was hers, and she was going to win. Chapter 12. Echoes of betrayal. The morning broke gray and cold, the sun struggling to cut through the thick mist that had settled over the forest. Sophia woke with the pendant still clutched in her hand, its familiar warmth soothing but now tinged with the weight of the responsibility it represented. Elias was already awake, seated at the cabin's small kitchen table with a map spread out before him. His hair was mussed, and the dark circles under his eyes betrayed another night without sleep. "You didn't rest," Sophia said softly as she approached. "Didn't have time," Elias replied, not looking up. He traced a line on the map with his finger. "I think I've found where Lucien's pack is regrouping." Sophia sat across from him, her stomach twisting at the thought. "You're sure?" Elias nodded, his expression grim. "They've been circling us, testing the wards, but they haven't attacked again. That means they're waiting for something or someone." Sophia frowned. "Lucien." "Exactly." Elias leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping against the table. "If we can figure out what he's planning, we might have a chance to stop him before he makes his next move." "And how do we do that?" Sophia asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. Elias hesitated, his gaze flicking toward the window. "There's someone who might know, someone who's worked with Lucien in the past." Sophia tilted her head, catching the shift in his tone. "Worked with him? Like one of his wolves?" "Not exactly," Elias said, his jaw tightening. "He's not part of Lucien's pack anymore, but he has connections. If anyone can tell us what Lucien's after, it's him." Sophia narrowed her eyes. "And why do I feel like there's a catch?" Elias's silence was answer enough. "Who is he?" she pressed. "His name is Dorian," Elias said reluctantly. "He's a tracker, a mercenary. He doesn't care about sides, just money." Sophia felt a flicker of unease. "And you trust him?" "No," Elias admitted, "but I trust his greed. If we offer him enough, he'll talk." Sophia crossed her arms. "And what happens if he decides to sell us out to Lucien instead?" Elias gave her a wry smile. "That's why you're coming with me." Dorian's hideout was hidden deep in the forest, a crumbling stone structure that might have once been a hunting lodge. The air around it felt heavy, and Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Elias stopped a few feet from the door, gesturing for her to stay behind him. "Let me do the talking," he said. Sophia nodded, clutching the pendant beneath her jacket. Elias knocked once, the sound echoing through the stillness. Moments later, the door creaked open, revealing a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a noir film. Dorian was tall and lean, his dark hair slicked back, his sharp features illuminated by the faint glow of the lantern he held. His pale blue eyes swept over Elias, then landed on Sophia. Well, Dorian said, his lips curling into a smirk. The prodigal guardian and his companion. Sophia bristled, but Elias didn't react. "We need information," he said, his tone clipped. "And here I thought you were just dropping by for a chat." Dorian stepped aside, motioning them in. The inside of the lodge was as shabby as the exterior, with peeling wallpaper and furniture that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Dorian gestured toward a pair of chairs by the fireplace, sinking into one himself. "So," he said, leaning back with a casual air that felt entirely at odds with the tension in the room. "What can I do for you?" "Lucien," Elias said bluntly, "we need to know what he's planning." Dorian raised an eyebrow. "Straight to business. I like that." He glanced at Sophia, his smirk returning. "And what's she doing here? Moral support?" Sophia opened her mouth to retort, but Elias cut her off. "She's the reason Lucien's after us," he said, "and the reason you're going to help us." Dorian's eyes flicked to the pendant peeking out from beneath Sophia's jacket. His smirk faltered, replaced by something colder, sharper. "Ah, the Crescent pendant," he murmured. "I'd heard rumors it was active again, but I didn't believe it." Until now, Sophia shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. "What do you know about it?" "Enough," Dorian said, his tone turning serious. "The pendant isn't just a prison for the shadow. It's a key." And Lucien, he trailed off, his expression darkening. "He wants to use it to open something much worse." Sophia's heart sank. "Worse than the shadow?" Dorian nodded, his pale blue eyes glittering with a strange mix of fear and fascination. "The pendant was forged to bind one shadow, but there are others, creatures older, stronger, and far more dangerous. If Lucien can unlock the pendant's full power, he could tear open the veil between their world and ours." Sophia felt her stomach twist. "Why? What does he get out of it?" "Power," Dorian said simply. "Enough to reshape the world however he sees fit." Elias leaned forward, his voice low. "Where is he now?" Dorian hesitated, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "I can tell you where he was last seen, but it's not going to come cheap." Elias reached into his coat, pulling out a pouch of coins that jingled softly as he tossed it onto the table. Dorian opened it, inspecting the contents before nodding in satisfaction. "He's gathering his pack near Blackthorn Ridge," Dorian said, his tone shifting to businesslike. "There's an old ritual site there, one that's steeped in magic. If I had to guess, he's planning to use it to complete the bond between the shadow and her." He gestured toward Sophia. Sophia's blood ran cold. "What bond?" "The one that's already forming," Dorian said, his gaze locking onto hers. "The shadow's tied to you, Sophia, and if Lucien finishes the ritual, you'll belong to it. Body and soul." Her breath caught, fear clawing at her chest. "And if we stop him?" Dorian's smile was grim. "Then you might survive. But stopping Lucien won't stop the shadow. That's something you'll have to figure out on your own." Elias stood, his expression hard. "Let's go." Sophia followed him to the door, but as they stepped outside, Dorian's voice stopped them. "One last thing," he said, his tone almost casual. "Watch your back, Guardian. Not everyone in this fight is who they seem." The drive back to the cabin was silent, the weight of Dorian's warning hanging between them. Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to break, and when it did, there would be no going back. Chapter 13, The Hunter's Blade. The cabin felt colder when they returned, the fire in the hearth long since burned out. Sophia shivered as she stepped inside, the weight of Dorian's words pressing down on her. Not everyone in this fight is who they seem. Elias shut the door behind them, his movements stiff and tense. He'd been silent the entire drive, his gaze distant as though lost in thoughts he didn't want to share. "Elias," Sophia said cautiously, setting her bag down. "What did he mean? About watching our backs?" He didn't answer at first, instead tossing his jacket onto the back of a chair. When he finally looked at her, his gray eyes were darker than she'd ever seen them. "Dorian thrives on paranoia," he said, his tone clipped. "Don't let him get in your head." Sophia frowned. "But what if he's right? What if someone's working with Lucien, someone we don't know about?" Elias's jaw tightened, and she could see the muscles in his neck strain. "We don't have time to chase shadows. Right now, our focus needs to be on stopping Lucien before he finishes that ritual." His dismissal only made her more uneasy. "Elias, what aren't you telling me?" "I've told you everything you need to know," he snapped, his voice sharper than he intended. Sophia flinched, the sudden edge in his tone catching her off guard. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the tension in the room crackling like static. "I'm sorry," Elias said finally, his voice softening. "I didn't mean to know," Sophia interrupted, crossing her arms. "You don't get to shut me out, not after everything that's happened. If there's something you're not telling me, I deserve to know." Elias looked at her for a long moment, his expression conflicted. Finally, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not that simple," he said, his voice low. "There are things about my past, about my family, that I don't talk about. Not because I don't trust you, but because they don't matter anymore." Sophia's stomach twisted. "How can you say that? If it has anything to do with Lucien, or the shadow, or this mark, then it does matter." Elias hesitated, the walls he'd built around himself flickering for just a moment. "My family wasn't just guarding the pendant," he admitted. "They were part of something bigger, a network of hunters tasked with keeping ancient powers like the shadow contained. But not all of them agreed on how to do it." Sophia's heart sank. "What do you mean?" "There was a split," Elias said, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Some of them believed the only way to stop the shadow was to destroy the pendant and anyone tied to it." Sophia froze, her breath catching in her throat. "You mean me?" Elias looked up, his expression pained. "It's not like that anymore. Most of them are gone, and the ones who survived don't know the pendant is active again. But if they did," he trailed off, his meaning clear. Sophia felt a cold wave of fear wash over her. "So you're saying there could be people out there who would rather kill me than risk the shadow escaping?" "Yes," Elias admitted quietly. "But as long as I'm here, that's not going to happen." The weight of his words settled heavily between them, and Sophia struggled to process what he'd just revealed. She wanted to be angry, to demand why he hadn't told her sooner, but all she felt was a deep, bone-deep exhaustion. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias straightened, his expression hardening. "We go to Blackthorn Ridge. We stop Lucien. And we make sure no one else comes after you." The road to Blackthorn Ridge was long and winding, cutting through dense forests that seemed darker than they should have been. Sophia sat in the passenger seat, the pendant resting against her chest like a brand. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though every time she glanced out the window, the shadows between the trees remained still. "We're close," Elias said, breaking the silence. Sophia glanced at him. "Do you have a plan for when we get there?" "Stop Lucien," Elias said simply. "That's not a plan," Sophia pointed out, her frustration bubbling to the surface. Elias's lips twitched in a faint smirk. "It's a start." Sophia rolled her eyes but didn't press the issue. She knew better than to expect a detailed strategy from Elias. He was a fighter, not a strategist. Still, the thought of facing Lucien again without a clear plan made her stomach churn. When they reached the ridge, the air was thick with tension. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath their boots as they approached the clearing where Dorian had said Lucien would be. Sophia clutched the pendant tightly, her fingers brushing the crescent-shaped mark on her palm. The faint warmth pulsing from the pendant steadied her, but it wasn't enough to drown out the fear twisting in her chest. Elias held up a hand, signaling for her to stop. He crouched low, scanning the clearing ahead. "There," he whispered, pointing to the center of the clearing. Sophia followed his gaze and felt her breath catch. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient stone altar, covered in runes that glowed faintly in the moonlight. Around it, Lucien's wolves stood in a loose circle, their forms shifting between human and beast. And at the center of it all was Lucien, his golden eyes gleaming as he stared at the altar. He held a blade in his hand, its edge shimmering with an unnatural light. "What's he doing?" Sophia whispered. Elias's jaw tightened, preparing the ritual. If he finishes it, he didn't have to finish the sentence. Sophia could feel it, the dark energy radiating from the altar, the way it seemed to pull at her like a magnet. "We have to stop him," she said, her voice trembling. Elias nodded, his expression grim. "Stay close to me. They moved quickly but quietly, weaving through the trees until they were just outside the clearing. Sophia's heart pounded in her chest as they crouched behind a fallen log, the pendant warm against her skin. Lucian's voice rose above the silence, low and commanding, as he began to chant in a language Sophia didn't recognize. The runes on the altar glowed brighter, the air around them thickening with power. Elias glanced at her, his expression tense. "When I give the signal, run for the altar. You have to disrupt the ritual before he finishes it." "What about you?" Sophia asked, her stomach twisting. "I'll cover you," Elias said, his grip tightening on his blade. Sophia nodded, swallowing hard. She didn't know if this would work, but she didn't have a choice. Elias counted down under his breath, then leapt into the clearing with a roar, his blade flashing in the moonlight. The wolves turned, snarling as they charged toward him, but he moved with precision and speed, cutting them down before they could reach him. "Go," he shouted. Sophia bolted, her heart racing as she sprinted toward the altar. Lucian turned to her, his golden eyes narrowing in surprise, but she didn't stop. As she reached the altar, the pendant flared with heat, the runes on the stone flickering as if in response. Sophia grabbed the edge of the altar, her breath coming in short bursts. And then Lucian was there, his blade raised, his voice cold and calm. "You should have stayed hidden, Sophia." Chapter 14. Through fire and shadow, Sophia froze as Lucian's blade hovered over her, its edge gleaming with a strange, iridescent light that made her skin crawl. The air around him pulsed with power, his golden eyes glowing brighter as he stepped closer to her. "Do you even know what you're holding?" he asked, his voice as smooth and venomous as silk. Sophia's breath hitched, the pendant burning hot against her chest as if in warning. "I know enough to stop you," she said, forcing the words past the lump in her throat. Lucian chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "Stop me. You can't even control the shadow inside you. Do you feel it? How it pulls at you? How it whispers your name?" Sophia's hand tightened around the pendant. She could feel the shadow's presence, dark and restless like a storm building inside her. But she pushed the fear aside, focusing instead on the warmth of the crescent moon in her palm. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Lucian's smirk widened. "You should be." With a flick of his wrist, he brought the blade down. Sophia threw herself to the side, the blade slamming into the altar where she had been standing. Sparks flew as the runes on the stone flared, their glow flickering under the force of the impact. The pendant burned against her chest, its warmth surging as she scrambled to her feet. Lucian turned toward her, his movements impossibly smooth. "Do you know what I admire about you, Sophia?" he said, his tone mocking. "Your stubbornness. It's almost inspiring." She didn't respond. Instead, she reached for the pendant, gripping it tightly as she tried to summon the light she'd felt during her training with Elias. The heat in the crescent moon grew, spreading through her hand and up her arm like fire, but the light didn't come. Lucian tilted his head, watching her struggle with an expression of amusement. "You can't use its power without accepting what you are," he said, his voice soft and coaxing. "The shadow is part of you now, Sophia. Stop fighting it. Embrace it, and you'll have power beyond your wildest dreams. Don't listen to him." Sophia turned to see Elias fighting off two wolves near the edge of the clearing, his blade flashing as he dodged their attacks. Blood dripped from a cut on his forehead, but his movements were precise, every strike calculated. Lucian sighed, his gaze flicking toward Elias. "Your guardian is persistent, I'll give him that," he said. "But he's fighting a battle he can't win. They never do." Sophia's pulse quickened as she turned back to Lucian. "You don't know anything about me," she said, her voice trembling with anger. Lucian raised an eyebrow, his golden eyes narrowing. "Don't I?" He stepped closer, and for a moment the air around her seemed to ripple, his presence pressing down on her like a physical weight. Sophia's knees buckled, but she refused to fall, gripping the pendant tighter as she fought to steady herself. "I know the shadow calls to you," Lucian said, his voice low and insistent. "I know it offers you freedom, power, a way to break free from the fear that's holding you back. And I know that deep down you want it." Sophia's breath caught, his words hitting a nerve she hadn't expected. The shadow did call to her. She could feel it in her dreams, in the moments of quiet when her mind wandered too far. It was always there, whispering promises she didn't want to hear but couldn't ignore. But she wasn't going to give in. Taking a deep breath, she closed her eyes and focused on the pendant. The warmth spread through her chest, steady and insistent, pushing back against the shadow's pull. "You don't know me," she said, her voice stronger this time. Lucian's expression shifted, his amusement giving way to something darker. "Then show me who you are," he said, lunging toward her. Sophia reacted on instinct. She raised the pendant, its heat flaring as a burst of silver light erupted from the crescent moon. The light slammed into Lucian, throwing him backward with a snarl. He hit the ground hard, but instead of anger, he laughed, the sound sending chills down her spine. "There it is," he said, pushing himself to his feet. "That's the power I've been waiting for." Sophia's heart pounded as she backed away, the pendant still glowing faintly in her hand. She glanced toward Elias, who had just taken down one of the wolves and was closing in on the second. "Elias," she shouted. He looked up, his eyes widening as he saw Lucian advancing toward her again. "Run!" he shouted, but Sophia didn't move. Instead, she stood her ground, the pendant's warmth giving her courage. Lucian raised his blade, his golden eyes burning with determination. "You can't stop this, Sophia. The shadow belongs to me, and soon so will you." Sophia clenched her fists, her fear giving way to anger. "You're wrong," she said, her voice steady. "The shadow doesn't belong to anyone. Not you, not me. And I'm going to make sure it stays that way." With a surge of determination, she focused on the pendant, willing its power to rise. The light flared again, brighter this time, enveloping her in a silvery glow. She felt the shadow's pull, but she didn't let it consume her. Instead, she used it, channeling its energy into the pendant. Lucian snarled, his blade swinging toward her, but the light burst from the pendant like a wave, slamming into him with the force of a hurricane. He stumbled back, his golden eyes wide with shock. "This isn't over," he growled, his voice echoing with fury. Before Sophia could respond, he disappeared into the shadows, his wolves retreating with him. The clearing fell silent, the oppressive energy dissipating as the light from the pendant faded. Sophia collapsed to her knees, her body trembling with exhaustion. Elias was at her side in an instant, his hand on her shoulder. "You did it," he said, his voice full of relief. Sophia looked up at him, her chest heaving. "It's not over," she said, her voice shaking. "He's still out there." And the shadow Elias nodded, his expression grim. "I know. But you're stronger than he is, Sophia. Stronger than the shadow, too." She wanted to believe him. But deep down, she knew the fight was far from over. Chapter 15, The Pack's Betrayal. The safe house no longer felt safe. Sophia sat by the fireplace, staring at the flames as they licked the charred wood. The heat should have been comforting, but her skin still felt cold, as though the shadow's presence lingered long after Lucian and his wolves had retreated. Elias was at the kitchen table, sharpening his blade. The rhythmic scrape of metal on stone was the only sound in the room, and it did nothing to ease the tension stretching between them. Sophia tightened her grip on the pendant, her mind replaying the fight in the clearing. The burst of light, Lucian's twisted smile as he disappeared into the shadows, it all felt like a prelude to something worse. "They're not going to stop," she said finally, breaking the silence. Elias looked up, his gray eyes tired but resolute. "No, they won't." Sophia turned toward him, the weight of everything pressing on her chest. "So what's the plan? Because right now it feels like we're just waiting for them to come back stronger." Elias's gaze flickered, a flash of something unspoken crossing his face. He set the blade down, leaning back in his chair. "We need information," he said. "Lucian's playing a bigger game than we realized. If we're going to stop him, we need to know exactly what he's planning and who else might be helping him." Sophia frowned. "Helping him? You think he's working with someone?" "Lucian's smart," Elias said, "but even he can't pull off something like this alone. The ritual at Blackthorn Ridge, the way his pack keeps finding us, it's too coordinated." Someone's feeding him information. Sophia's stomach twisted. You think there's a traitor? Elias hesitated, his jaw tightening. It's possible. The thought sent a chill through her. Dorian's warning echoed in her mind. Not everyone in this fight is who they seem. Do you think it's Dorian? Sophia asked cautiously. Elias shook his head. Dorian's loyal to one thing: money. Lucien doesn't have enough of it to buy him outright. But there are others: wolves, shapeshifters, people who have sided with Lucien for reasons we don't understand yet. Sophia sat back, the weight of his words settling heavily in her chest. If there really was a traitor working with Lucien, it meant they were in even more danger than she'd realized. The next morning, Sophia woke to find Elias already gone. A note sat on the table patrolling the perimeter. Stay inside. Back soon. Sophia frowned, her unease growing. Elias never left without warning her in person. She paced the cabin, the pendant warm against her chest as she tried to focus on anything other than the growing sense of dread gnawing at her. She was mid-stride when the sound of footsteps outside made her freeze. Her heart leapt into her throat as she grabbed the closest thing resembling a weapon, a heavy iron poker from the fireplace. She edged toward the door, her pulse pounding in her ears. The knock came softly at first, then louder. Sophia, it's Maddie. Sophia's breath caught. She rushed to the door, her hands trembling as she unlocked it. When she pulled it open, Maddie stood on the porch, looking disheveled and pale. Maddie, Sophia's voice wavered. What are you doing here? How did you? I've been looking for you for days, Maddie interrupted, her voice cracking. I thought something happened to you, and then someone told me you'd been seen heading out of the city, so I followed. Sophia stepped aside to let her in, her mind spinning. Maddie's sudden appearance didn't make sense. She'd gone to great lengths to make sure no one knew where she and Elias were hiding. As Maddie stepped into the cabin, her eyes darted around, taking in the sparse furnishings. You've been staying here? She asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. It's not permanent, Sophia said quickly. Maddie, you shouldn't have come here. It's not safe. Maddie turned to her, her expression shifting. Not safe from what? Sophia hesitated. She had no idea how to explain everything that had happened without sounding insane. It's complicated, she said finally. Maddie's gaze softened. Sophia, I'm your best friend. Whatever's going on, you can trust me. Sophia opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. Something felt off. Maddie's presence, the way she'd found the cabin, the urgency in her voice. How did you find me? Sophia asked, her tone sharper than she intended. Maddie blinked, caught off guard. I told you I heard someone mention you were heading this way. Who? Maddie hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the door. I don't know, just someone in town. Sophia's chest tightened. She wanted to believe Maddie, but the nagging voice in the back of her mind wouldn't let her. Before she could say anything else, the door opened and Elias stepped inside. He froze when he saw Maddie, his expression hardening instantly. What's she doing here? He demanded, his voice low and sharp. She found me, Sophia said quickly. She tracked you, Elias corrected, his gaze narrowing. Maddie's eyes widened, her expression turning defensive. I didn't track anyone. I was worried about Sophia. You shouldn't be here, Elias interrupted, his tone cold. Sophia stepped between them, her frustration bubbling over. Stop, she's my best friend, Elias. She's not a threat. But even as she said the words, doubt crept in. Elias didn't look convinced. How did she find us? I told you, Maddie said, her voice shaking. I asked around. I just wanted to make sure Sophia was okay. The tension in the room was suffocating. Elias stared at Maddie for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he stepped closer, lowering his voice. If you're lying, he said, I'll know. Maddie's face twisted in anger. Who the hell do you think you are? Before Elias could respond, the pendant around Sophia's neck flared with heat. She gasped, clutching it as a wave of energy surged through her. The air in the cabin shifted, heavy and suffocating. And then she saw a flicker of darkness in Maddie's eyes, so quick she almost missed it. Her blood ran cold. Maddie, she whispered, her voice trembling. What did you do? Maddie's expression faltered, the mask slipping for just a moment. Sophia, the pendant flared again, its light spilling across the room. Maddie recoiled, her form shimmering as the illusion shattered. It wasn't Maddie. The figure standing before her shifted, its features twisting into something monstrous. Golden eyes burned where Maddie's had been, and a cruel, familiar smile spread across its face. Lucien, Sophia breathed. Chapter 16, a truth revealed. The air in the cabin turned frigid, the shadows stretching unnaturally as Lucien's true form solidified. Gone was the comforting face of Maddie. In her place stood the wolfish figure of Lucien, his golden eyes glowing with amusement and triumph. Elias moved instantly, stepping between Sophia and Lucien with his blade drawn. "How did you get through the wards?" he demanded, his voice sharp. Lucien tilted his head, the movement eerily graceful. "Wards are only as strong as the one who maintains them," he said, his tone mocking. "And you, Guardian, have been stretched too thin. It was almost too easy." Sophia's hands trembled as she gripped the pendant. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice quivering despite her efforts to sound strong. Lucien's eyes flicked to her and his smirk widened. "You already know the answer to that. You're wasting your time," Elias growled, positioning himself defensively. "She's stronger than you think. Whatever game you're playing, it ends here." Lucien chuckled, low and menacing. "Oh, Elias, always so quick to play the hero. Tell me, how many lives have you saved by clinging to that blade of yours? How many people have you failed?" Elias didn't react, but Sophia saw the faint tightening of his jaw, the flicker of pain in his eyes. Lucien stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "You can't protect her forever. The shadow already belongs to her. It's only a matter of time before she embraces it." And when she does, his gaze shifted back to Sophia, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You'll come to me willingly." Sophia's chest tightened as the pendant grew warmer in her hand, the shadow within it stirring. She could feel it pulling at her, whispering promises she didn't want to hear. "I won't let that happen," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. Lucien's smile didn't falter. "We'll see." With a sudden burst of speed, he lunged toward her, his claws slashing through the air. Elias intercepted him, their blades clashing with a deafening ring. The force of the impact sent sparks flying, and Sophia stumbled back, her heart pounding. "Run!" Elias shouted, his voice strained as he pushed against Lucien's strength. Sophia hesitated, the pendant's heat growing almost unbearable. She didn't want to leave Elias, but the look in his eyes left no room for argument. "Go," he barked. Sophia turned and bolted, her feet carrying her out of the cabin and into the dark forest beyond. The cold air stung her skin, and every shadow seemed alive, reaching for her as she ran. The forest was a maze of twisting paths and looming trees, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. Sophia's breath came in ragged gasps as she stumbled over roots and rocks, her chest burning from exertion. The pendant pulsed against her chest, its light faint but steady, guiding her deeper into the woods. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to keep moving. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of the fight, Elias's shouts, the clash of steel and the snarls of wolves. The sounds grew fainter with each step she took, and guilt gnawed at her. She'd left him behind to face Lucien alone, but Elias had told her to run. He'd made her promise to survive. Suddenly, the pendant flared brighter, the light piercing the darkness around her. Sophia skidded to a halt, shielding her eyes as the glow illuminated a clearing ahead. In the center of the clearing stood a massive stone structure, weathered and ancient, its surface etched with runes that glowed faintly in the moonlight. The energy emanating from it was palpable, a thrumming force that made her knees weak. She stepped closer, her heart pounding. The pendant grew warmer, its light pulsing in rhythm with the runes. "What is this place?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's your inheritance." Sophia spun around, her blood running cold as Lucien emerged from the shadows. His golden eyes burned with triumph, his movements slow and confident as he stepped into the clearing. "How did you?" "Elias is occupied," Lucien said, cutting her off. but don't worry, he'll live. For now. Sophia backed away, her hands trembling as she clutched the pendant. Stay away from me. Lucian ignored her, his gaze fixed on the stone structure. Do you know what this is? He asked, his tone almost reverent. This is where it began, where the shadow was first bound. Sophia glanced at the structure, her fear mixing with confusion. Why are you telling me this? Because you need to understand, Sophia, Lucian said, stepping closer. The shadow isn't your enemy. It's your birthright. It's a gift, one that's been waiting for you to claim it. She shook her head, her grip on the pendant tightening. You're lying. The shadow is a curse. It's evil. Lucian's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold intensity. Evil is just a matter of perspective, he said. The shadow is power. The kind of power that could change the world, end wars, topple empires, reshape reality itself. And it's yours, Sophia. All you have to do is stop fighting it. Sophia's heart pounded as his words sank in. The pendant grew hotter, the shadow within it stirring restlessly. I don't want that kind of power, she said, her voice trembling. Lucian tilted his head, his golden eyes narrowing. No, then why hasn't it consumed you? Why do you still hold the pendant even now? Sophia opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Lucian took another step closer, his voice softening. You've felt it, haven't you? The connection. The way the shadow makes you stronger, sharper. It doesn't want to destroy you, Sophia. It wants to become part of you. Tears pricked her eyes as she shook her head. You're wrong. I'm not like you. Lucian smiled faintly, a shadow of something almost human flickering across his face. You're more like me than you realize. The pendant flared again, the light surging between them like a barrier. Lucian's expression twisted with frustration, but he didn't move. This isn't over, he said, his voice low and menacing. You can't run from what you are forever. Before Sophia could respond, he stepped back into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. The clearing fell silent, the pendant's light fading until only the faint glow of the runes remained. Sophia sank to her knees, her chest heaving as the weight of his words settled over her. She didn't know what to believe anymore. But one thing was certain, the shadow was part of her now, and no matter how much she wanted to fight it, she couldn't deny the truth any longer. Chapter 17, the breaking point. The forest seemed colder as Sophia stumbled back to the cabin, her legs heavy, her mind clouded with Lucian's words. The shadow's presence felt stronger now, as though his confrontation had somehow awakened it further. The shadow is part of you, it's your inheritance. She wanted to reject it, to cling to her own sense of self, but the truth was undeniable. The shadow's power was inside her, and every time she fought against it, it fought back harder. The cabin came into view, its windows glowing faintly from the fire Elias had likely rebuilt. Relief flooded her chest as she saw the familiar silhouette standing on the porch. He was alive. Elias, she called out, her voice hoarse. He turned toward her, his face battered and bloodied, but his eyes lit up when he saw her. Sophia. She hurried up the steps, but before she could speak, Elias reached for her shoulders, his grip firm but gentle. Are you hurt? No, she said, shaking her head. Lucian was there at the clearing. He said things about the shadow about me. Elias's jaw tightened, and he guided her inside, shutting the door firmly behind them. What did he say? Sophia hesitated, the weight of Lucian's words pressing on her chest. He said the shadow is my inheritance, that it's part of me. She looked up at Elias, her voice trembling. And the worst part is I don't know if he's wrong. Elias's eyes softened, his grip on her shoulders tightening briefly before he let her go. Lucian's a manipulator. He tells you half-truths to make you doubt yourself. But what if he's not lying? Sophia said, stepping away. Every time I use the pendant, I feel it, the shadow pulling at me. It's not just a curse, Elias. It's alive, and it's in me now. Elias moved toward her, his gray eyes steady. That doesn't mean it controls you. Sophia laughed bitterly, running a hand through her hair. How can you be so sure? What if I'm just delaying the inevitable? What if I become like him? You won't, Elias said firmly. You're stronger than he is. Her frustration bubbled over. You keep saying that like it's supposed to fix everything, but what if I'm not? What if he's right and I end up hurting people? The silence that followed was suffocating. Elias looked at her, his expression unreadable, and for a moment, Sophia thought he might finally tell her something she didn't want to hear. Instead, he said softly, "Then I'll stop you." Sophia froze, her heart twisting. "I made a promise to protect you," Elias continued, his voice steady but full of an emotion she couldn't quite name. "But if the shadow ever takes control, if you lose yourself to it, I'll do whatever it takes to bring you back." Sophia's breath hitched and tears pricked her eyes. "You can't promise that." "I can," Elias said, his gaze unwavering. "And I will." She looked away, her chest tightening as she tried to swallow the lump in her throat. She wanted to believe him, to trust that he could pull her back from the edge if it ever came to that. But deep down, she wasn't sure if anyone could. The next day, Sophia woke to the sound of Elias moving around the cabin, gathering supplies. He'd been quieter than usual that morning, his focus entirely on preparing for what lay ahead. "What are you doing?" she asked, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "We're not staying here," Elias said without looking at her. "The wards are compromised and Lucien knows where we are. We need to keep moving." Sophia sat up, dread pooling in her stomach. "Where are we going?" Elias hesitated, his hand pausing over the blade he'd been sharpening. "There's an old stronghold not far from here. It's abandoned, but it's fortified. If Lucien's planning another attack, it'll give us the high ground." Sophia nodded, but her unease only deepened. She couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in, that no matter where they ran, Lucien would find her. As they packed, the pendant grew warmer against her chest, its pulse faint but steady. It was a reminder of everything she was carrying, of the power she couldn't escape. The stronghold was a crumbling fortress deep in the woods, its stone walls weathered by time and covered in moss. It felt ancient, the air around it thick with the weight of forgotten battles. Sophia followed Elias inside, her footsteps echoing on the stone floor. The main hall was vast and empty, with high ceilings and a cold draft that made her shiver. "This place feels haunted," she said quietly. "It's not," Elias replied, though his voice carried a similar unease. "But it's seen its fair share of death." Sophia glanced around, her fingers brushing the pendant as if to reassure herself. "You think Lucien will come here?" "He'll follow the pendant," Elias said, his voice grim. "He always does." They set up camp in one of the smaller rooms, where the walls felt less like they were closing in. Elias worked to reinforce what little magic remained in the stronghold, marking runes on the doors and windows. Sophia sat by the fire they'd built, staring into the flames as her thoughts spiraled. She could feel the shadow inside her, restless and waiting, and the weight of it was suffocating. Elias sat down beside her, his presence grounding but quiet. "You're thinking about what he said," not as a question but as a statement. Sophia nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if he's right? What if I can't fight it forever?" Elias looked at her, his expression softer than she'd ever seen it. "You don't have to fight it alone." Sophia met his gaze, her chest tightening. "You keep saying that, but what if I'm not enough?" Elias reached out, his hand brushing hers. "Then we'll figure it out together, no matter what happens." For the first time in days, Sophia felt a flicker of hope. It was fragile and fleeting, but it was enough to hold on to. That night, the stronghold was eerily quiet. Sophia lay awake, staring at the ceiling as the pendant's warmth pulsed against her chest. She could feel the shadow stirring, its presence stronger than ever, and her dreams were full of whispers she couldn't quite make out. But when she woke, it wasn't the shadow she feared. It was the sound of footsteps outside the room, slow and deliberate, followed by a low growl that made her blood run cold. Lucien had found them. Chapter 18, The Crescent unbound. The growl echoed through the stone halls, low and menacing, making Sophia's breath hitch in her throat. She sat frozen on the edge of her makeshift bedroll, her fingers instinctively gripping the pendant. Its warmth flared, pulsing like a heartbeat against her chest. Elias was already on his feet, his blade in hand, moving toward the door with the quiet precision of someone who had lived through too many battles. He glanced back at her, his gray eyes sharp. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophia nodded, her heart pounding. The footsteps outside grew louder, accompanied by the faint scrape of claws against stone. Sophia's pulse quickened as a shadow passed under the doorframe, too large to be anything human. The door creaked as something pressed against it, testing its strength. For a moment, the air was so still that Sophia could hear her own breathing, shallow and quick. And then the door shattered. A wolf-like creature lunged into the room, its eyes glowing a sickly gold, its snarls reverberating through the stone walls. Elias was on it in an instant, his blade slicing through the air with deadly precision. "Go!" Elias shouted over his shoulder as he drove the creature back toward the hall. Sophia hesitated, fear rooting her to the spot. But then another wolf burst into the room, its teeth bared as it charged toward her. The pendant flared in her hand, its light searing as it reacted to her panic. Instinctively, Sophia raised it, and a pulse of silver energy erupted from the crescent moon, slamming into the creature and sending it flying into the far wall. Sophia gasped, her hand trembling as she stared at the pendant. The light faded as quickly as it had come, leaving her in the dim glow of the firelight. "Sophia," Elias's voice snapped her back to reality. He was standing in the hall, fending off two more wolves, his blade flashing in the darkness. Get to the altar. She didn't have time to think. Clutching the pendant, she ran past him and into the corridor, her footsteps echoing on the stone floor. The stronghold seemed darker now, the shadows pressing in around her, but the pull of the pendant guided her like a beacon. The altar room wasn't far. She burst through a heavy wooden door and into the massive chamber, her chest heaving as she skidded to a stop. The room was dominated by a stone altar, its surface carved with runes that glowed faintly in the pale moonlight streaming through a broken window. The air was thick with energy, and the pendant in her hand grew warmer, its light flickering like a flame. Lucian was waiting. He stood on the far side of the altar, his golden eyes gleaming with triumph. His wolves flanked him, their forms shifting unnervingly between human and beast. "You came," Lucian said, his voice smooth and dangerous. "I knew you would." Sophia's hands shook as she stepped closer to the altar, keeping it between herself and Lucian. "What do you want from me?" Lucian tilted his head, his smile sharp. "I've already told you. The shadow belongs to you, Sophia, but you don't know how to wield it. Let me help you." "I don't need your help," she said, her voice shaking. Lucian chuckled, the sound low and cold. "You don't even know what you're holding, do you? That pendant wasn't just a prison, it was a fragment of the shadow itself. Its power is yours to command if you'd only stop fighting it." Sophia's grip on the pendant tightened. "You're lying. You just want the power for yourself." Lucian's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold intensity. "You think this is about me. You think I'd go to all this trouble just to steal your little trinket." He stepped closer, his presence suffocating. "This is bigger than you, Sophia. Bigger than any of us. The shadow is meant to reshape this broken world, and you're the only one who can set it free." The pendant grew hot in her hand, the light within it flickering erratically. Sophia could feel the shadow stirring, its presence pushing against her mind like a tide. Lucian held out a hand, his voice softening. "Stop running from it. Stop denying what you are. Embrace the shadow, and you'll never have to be afraid again." Sophia's chest tightened as the pendant pulsed in her hand. The temptation was there, whispering to her in the back of her mind. She could feel the power waiting for her, vast and endless, promising strength and freedom. But she also felt the cost. Her knees buckled as the shadow's presence pressed harder, its whispers growing louder. She dropped to the floor, clutching the pendant as tears streamed down her face. "I don't want this," she whispered. "I don't want any of this." Lucian crouched in front of her, his voice low and coaxing. "You don't have a choice, Sophia. The shadow chose you. You can either embrace it or let it consume you." "Sophia," Elias's voice cut through the darkness, sharp and commanding. She looked up to see him standing in the doorway, bloodied but alive, his blade gleaming in the moonlight. Lucian's expression darkened. "Always the guardian," he muttered. Elias moved between them, his stance protective as he pointed his blade at Lucien. "Get away from her." Lucien straightened, his golden eyes narrowing. "You're wasting your time. She can't fight this forever, Elias." "You know that as well as I do. She's stronger than you think," Elias said, his voice steady. Lucien smirked. "We'll see." With a flick of his hand, the wolves surged forward, snarling as they attacked. Elias met them head-on, his blade flashing as he fought to keep them away from Sophia. Sophia forced herself to stand, the pendant burning hot against her chest. The energy in the room was overwhelming, the shadows' pull almost unbearable. But she wasn't going to let it win. Clutching the pendant, she stepped toward the altar, her heart pounding as the runes flared brighter. She didn't know what she was doing, but the pull of the pendant guided her, its light growing stronger as she placed it on the stone. Lucien's eyes widened in realization. No, the moment the pendant touched the altar, the room erupted with light. Sophia screamed as the energy surged through her, the shadow's presence roaring in her mind. But she didn't let go. The light from the pendant grew brighter, pushing back the darkness as the runes on the altar flared with power. Lucien stumbled back, his golden eyes burning with fury as he shouted, "You don't know what you're doing." Sophia's voice rose above the chaos, steady and defiant. "I'm ending this." Chapter 19, Ashes and Moonlight. The light from the altar consumed the room, spilling through the cracks in the stone walls and illuminating every shadow. The wolves recoiled, howling in agony as the silver glow burned away their monstrous forms, forcing them back into human shape. Sophia stood at the center of it all, her hands pressed firmly on the pendant as it pulsed with a power that felt both foreign and familiar. The shadow within her roared in protest, its voice clawing at her mind, but she didn't let it take control. Not this time. Lucien stumbled toward her, his golden eyes blazing with fury. "You don't understand what you're doing." He shouted, his voice cracking. "You're destroying everything you could have been." Sophia gritted her teeth, her body trembling as the energy surged through her. The pendant burned hotter, the crescent moon glowing so brightly it was almost blinding. She felt the shadow pushing back, trying to overwhelm her, but she didn't let go. "I'm not destroying anything," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I'm taking it back." Lucien lunged toward her, but Elias was faster. He intercepted him with a roar, their blades clashing with a force that sent sparks flying. "Finish it!" Elias shouted, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. Sophia focused all her strength on the pendant, the light growing brighter with every passing second. She could feel the shadow unraveling, its hold on her weakening as the altar's power surged through it. "Let go!" The shadow's voice hissed in her mind, a desperate, venomous whisper. "You need me, Sophia. Without me, you're nothing." Sophia closed her eyes, her tears falling freely as she forced the words out. "You're wrong. I don't need you. I never did." The pendant flared with a final burst of light, and the shadow screamed, its presence tearing away from her like a storm, dissipating in an instant. The sound of its rage echoed through the room before fading into silence. Sophia collapsed to her knees, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the light dimmed. The pendant lay on the altar, its glow fading to a faint shimmer. Lucien staggered back, his face pale and his golden eyes wide with disbelief. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You've sealed it again. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Sophia looked up at him, her exhaustion giving way to a quiet strength. "I stopped you." Lucien's expression twisted with anger, but before he could move, Elias's blade pressed against his throat. "Don't," Elias warned, his voice cold and unyielding. Lucien's eyes flicked between them, calculating his next move, but he didn't resist. "This isn't over," he said, his tone venomous. "You think you've won, but the shadow is still inside you. It'll always be there, waiting." Sophia stood slowly, her legs shaking but her resolve unbroken. "Maybe," she said, her voice quiet but steady, "but it's my choice now, not yours." Lucien's gaze lingered on her, a strange mixture of fury and admiration flickering in his eyes. Then, with a growl, he melted into the shadows, disappearing as if he'd never been there at all. The silence that followed was deafening. Elias lowered his blade, his shoulders sagging with relief as he turned to Sophia. "Are you okay?" She nodded, though her body felt like it was about to collapse. "I think so." He crossed the room to her, his hand resting on her shoulder as he studied her face. "You did it." Sophia looked at the pendant on the altar, its once overwhelming power now reduced to a faint hum. "I don't know if it's over," she admitted, "but it feels quieter." Elias nodded, his expression softening. "That's a start." They left the stronghold at dawn, the faint light of the rising sun breaking through the dense trees. Sophia leaned on Elias as they made their way through the forest, her body still weak from the battle but her spirit lighter than it had been in days. "What happens now?" she asked as they approached the edge of the woods. Elias glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "We rebuild. We figure out what comes next. Together." Sophia returned his smile, a warmth blooming in her chest that had nothing to do with the pendant. "I think I can live with that." By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was fully up, casting golden light across the clearing. Sophia paused on the porch, looking out at the horizon. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of peace. The shadow's whispers were gone, and though she could still feel its presence deep inside her, it no longer felt like a threat. Elias stood beside her, his hand brushing hers. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, you know." Sophia glanced at him, a faint blush rising to her cheeks. "I had help." He smiled, and for a moment, the weight of everything they'd endured felt lighter. As they stepped inside, Sophia's gaze fell on the pendant, now resting on the table. Its glow was faint, but it was steady, a reminder of the battle they'd fought and the bond they'd forged. And as the sun rose higher, casting warmth and light over the cabin, Sophia allowed herself to believe for the first time that they'd earned this peace. For now, at least, the shadows were gone. Chapter 20, A New Dawn. The cabin was quiet, the kind of silence that felt earned after a long storm. Sophia sat at the small table, the pendant resting in her hand. It no longer burned or pulsed with chaotic energy. Instead, it hummed faintly, like a heartbeat syncing with her own. Elias moved around the room, packing supplies into a worn leather bag. Though his movements were calm, Sophia could see the tension still lingering in his shoulders. Even after everything, neither of them fully trusted the peace they'd carved out. "What now?" she asked, breaking the silence. Elias paused, glancing at her. "We keep moving," he said. "Lucian's still out there, and even though the shadows sealed again, it's tied to you now. There will be others who want to use that power, just like he did." Sophia nodded, her fingers brushing over the crescent moon on the pendant. She'd expected as much. Even though the immediate threat was gone, she knew her life would never return to what it had been before she walked into that antique shop. "But we stopped him," she said, her voice soft but firm. "We stopped this. That has to mean something." "It does," Elias said, sitting across from her. "It means you're stronger than you think. And it means you have a choice now." Sophia frowned. "A choice?" Elias leaned forward, his gray eyes meeting hers. "You can keep running, keep hiding, or you can decide to fight back, to use the shadow's power for something good. It's your call, Sophia. No one else's." Sophia's grip on the pendant tightened. For so long, it had felt like her life was spiraling out of her control, like she was being pulled into something she didn't understand and couldn't escape. But now, for the first time, she felt a flicker of agency, a chance to shape her own future. "What if I can't control it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You already are," Elias said. "Every time you push back, every time you choose to be yourself instead of letting the shadow define you, you're in control." Sophia looked down at the pendant, the faint glow reflecting in her eyes. The shadow was still there, a part of her she couldn't deny, but it no longer felt like a weight she had to carry alone. "What if I want to stop running?" she asked, meeting his gaze. Elias smiled faintly, the tension in his shoulders easing. "Then we stop running." The decision felt monumental, but as they packed up the cabin and prepared to leave, Sophia felt a strange sense of calm. She wasn't sure where the road ahead would take them, but she knew she wouldn't face it alone. Elias's presence was steadying, his quiet confidence giving her strength. They worked side by side, their movements in sync as they prepared for whatever came next. As they stepped outside, the forest bathed in the golden light of morning. Sophia took a deep breath, the crisp air filling her lungs. "Do you think he'll come back?" she asked, glancing at Elias. "Lucian." Elias's expression darkened. "Probably. Men like him don't give up easily." Sophia nodded, her grip on the pendant tightening. "Then we'll be ready." Elias smiled, a rare, genuine expression that softened his sharp features. "We will." They didn't look back as they left the cabin, the forest closing around them like a protective shroud. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, Sophia didn't feel afraid. The shadow was part of her, but it didn't define her. She was more than the whispers, more than the power it promised. She was herself, Sophia Adler, and she was ready to face whatever came next.